We all have a different way of working with colour, and I think this tutorial can be of benefit for most of you, beginners, intermediate and advanced. Here's my most typical and essential straightforward colour workflow, which I approach both technically and visually, using colour perception to play the colours against each other without any tricks at all, teasing out colour that you didn't even know was there. The result is an image with much more depth and much more apparent sharpness. The commands I'm going to use are levels, curves for colour, curves for contrast only, another curves adjustment of colour, and a couple of selectively applied colour adjustment curves, as well as hue saturation to correct the blues. Finally, I'm going to use a selective colour layer to tweak the magenta fringes and some of the signs in the background. We start out with an image with an overall cast of green. This is something I can pretty much see with a naked eye, but I haven't actually got any irrefutable proof of that. I'm now going to start with a levels adjustment where I'm going to really check what the cast is. Now, levels is a command that I don't really use a lot these days. I tend to use the levels in the raw converter, and this of course has its equivalent in any other raw processor. So I'm going to now expand my dialog here. The first thing I do is to take just a general look at the histogram. What this tells me is that the highlights on the right hand side here more or less meets the edge here, but we're going to check that in a minute. It does have a little bit of clipping on the endpoint here. This image, by the way, is a scan, and what's clipped here is a little bit of the hat and possibly a little bit of the dress. In general, what it tells me is that there's not a lot of highlight, there's a lot of slightly darker mid-tone, and then it tapers off here in the shadows. So I'd say overall this has quite a good distribution of tone all over the dynamic range. When you first learn Photoshop, you probably learned to pull in the slider for the highlight so that it kind of meets the first part of the information here. We can do slightly better than that. If I do that just eyeballing it, I'll probably end up here at 247. Let me pull this right back, and I'm going to hold down the Option key. This is very similar to how I processed it in Adobe Camera Raw. So just hold down the Option key, the Alt key, and pull in the slider. You can see now a clipping display, which means the screen goes to black and colours start to emerge as I pull the slider in. The first colours to emerge were the yellows. That's worth noting. Yellows, greens. Well, as you know, the subject matter is yellow and green, so that makes sense. The red of the skin, finally more greens and yellows, and there's some blue emerging at the end. So I'm going to pull back this slider. I'm really just going to pull the slider into about 250. What this has done is remap the highlights just a tiny bit brighter at the end point. So let's go to the shadows and look at the same thing there. Pressing down the Option key, I'm going to pull in here, and as you can see there's some information that emerges immediately. It's kind of gone almost to black. Now in this case I don't think that's going to be a problem. It's a very small area and you don't actually expect to see any detail in that area, so I think we can get away with it. If this turned out to be a larger area where we would expect to have some information, we might have had to put some output levels into it. Generally that means that we're putting grey into the image, so you really want to try and avoid that. I'm just going to take that to the extreme. As you can see there, the image goes grey. So we try to avoid clipping as much as possible from the start. The same of course goes for the highlights, and there is a possibility that I may have to backtrack here on my highlights, but we'll see about that later. I'm not going to do any work on the midtones here. I could move this in either direction here to make it lighter or darker, but I'm actually going to use the curves for that, so I'm going to Command Z that and just bring it back to 1. I'll also take a little look at the color channels here, but I doubt I'll do anything in here. The red channel, as you can see, more or less mimics the general composite channel. There's nothing there that I'd actually like to change. So moving on to the green channel here, same again, and the blue channel, which clips just a little less there in the end point on the shadows. It also has a little bit more of a gap here in the highlights, so it has a shorter dynamic range. And this is really because we have this yellow cast all over. Going back to the RGB, I'm now ready to move on to the curves. I've zoomed into 100% view and I'm now making a curves adjustment layer where I'm going to start correcting in the color channels first. I want to get the color kind of ballpark right before I do anything about the contrast. I'm going to go straight to the blue channel because I feel there's this overpowering yellow in the image, and generally I'm just going to start with pulling that blue channel up ever so slightly. I feel that lifts the cast a little bit, but I'm actually going to just highlight this what I call the target tool. It's called the on image adjustment tool. Nice and short name. I use the name target tool. To create a little bit of a feeling of distance here in the image, I'm just going to literally pull up this area here. And as you can see there, you get a sense of haze. I might come back and adjust a little bit more here later on. This is all editable all the way. So let me just move on now to the red channel. I'm going to zoom out. It just gives me a fresher view of the image. I'm now going to just pull down a little bit here, still with that target tool selected. As you can see, the greens go more cyan now. That's obviously too much. But I'm going to now zoom in again and have a look at what that's doing with the face and this bit of fur. Now I'm going to lift the reds up a little bit there, warm it back up again, and zoom out. Now I still think I've done a little bit too much in the shadows there, so I'm going to just bring it back a bit. You can see now that you've got a bit more dimension to the colour. It's obviously still very bright in the greens, but it's a different kind of green now, not quite so yellow. Before I do any more work with the colour adjustments, I'd actually like to make an adjustment just for the contrast. So I'm making another curve. If I lift the curve, I'm going to make it brighter. Darken by lowering it. If I make an S-curve, here's a crude S-curve, I'm just playing around a little bit with it here. I introduce contrast, but I also introduce more vividness to the colour. Now I'm going to make a contrast that's a bit more subtle than that. I'm going to again highlight this target tool here and look for something that I think should be able to go a bit brighter. I would say that I think her face can tolerate going a little bit brighter. So I'm lifting it up from the face. That bends the whole curve upwards. So it lightens practically everything between the black and the white. I'm going to now find something that I think can tolerate a bit of darkening, and I think this area of the tree here can take a bit of darkening, and with it goes everything else. Now what you can see here is that you do have a kind of S-curve, but not as strong as before. I could have lightened the highlights more, but I don't want to because I think they're going to be quite strong, these highlights on the edges, and I don't want to blow anything out. This curves, as you can see, has actually introduced a bit more saturation as well. To temper that, I can blend this curve to luminosity. It doesn't always work, but as you can see, it worked in this case. If I Command Z and you keep your eyes peeled on the image, that's before I did the luminosity, and this is after the luminosity. It's subtle, but it tempers the saturation. Okay, reviewing what I've done with the image so far, I'm going to turn off all the 3 adjustment layers, and as you can see, we've gone from a very yellow image to an image that is more green but with more different colours. I'm going to now aim to break the colours more apart. I'm happy with the general contrast of the image, but I think this is going to add just a tiny bit more contrast and possibly a bit more colour contrast. So I add another overall curves adjustment, and I still feel that I need to get rid of some of the green here. So I'm going to click on the target tool, and as you know, blue cancels out yellow. So I'm just going to first start with removing a little bit of the yellow, lifting up the blue channel, which also means that I flatten the image just slightly. That's going to be counteracted by my next move, which is going to be in the green channel. Another thing that lifting the blue channel does, it makes the image just a little bit brighter. So it's worth bearing in mind that although you're working in one single channel, you're also brightening the image by lifting a channel. Let's go to the green channel, and here I'm going to just, first of all, just pull it down a little bit here, and now you can really see the colours starting to break apart. However, it's a little bit too much magenta. You can see particularly in the trees and also a little bit in the face and this fur. So I'm just going to bring that back up to the level where it was. This adjustment has made a big difference. Let's turn that off and toggle it back on again. Beautiful. With all the colours we've done so far, off, and a dramatic change, on again. With so many more colours than we had in the first place. All of these are global adjustments. None of them have actually been selective adjustments, so bear that in mind. Look at what it's doing. It's sharpening, it's bringing out variations of colour that were kind of lurking behind this overall yellow-green cast. Looking at the bottom of the image, the lower part of the image at the ground, I feel that it's a bit anemic, and it could do with a bit more gold, a bit more shine at the bottom, also a little bit more depth. Just to mention to you how this image was shot, it's a film capture on a 5.4 plate camera, so it's got a very strange depth of field going through it. As you can see here, there's this middle area here in focus, and the focus falls off at the top and towards the back quite dramatically, and also at the bottom, so you get an abstract shape where the dress ends. Okay, this is how I tend to do my selective adjustments. I like to make a test patch. I take the marquee tool here and drag myself a marquee, just making a big test patch there. Okay, I'm then using a curves adjustment again, and this time I'm going to head for the green channel, because what I see here is a quite magenta colour here in these blobs. Now I'd like to make this a little less pink, a little less magenta. So I'm going to target the tool there and then drag it upwards in these areas, these bright areas. And as you can see there, it's lifted the graph upwards. Now this is quite the opposite of what we've done earlier in the green channel. We've actually taken that more or less down all the way. I'm now going to target a darker colour and drag this a little bit downwards. You can see how this colour adjustment has neutralised a little bit of the pinkness here. I'm just going to turn that off and on again. But we're not quite done yet. We need to go to the blue channel. And again, I'm going to do a slightly different adjustment to what I've done earlier. I feel here that we need to take some blue away, so we actually drag that slightly downwards. I could try to add a little bit of red to the equation, and in that case I would move it just a tad upwards there to bring out some of the warmth at the bottom here. I've got to make sure that I don't go too much up, because then I tend to get that redness back in those bubbles. If you look at the mask, I now have a square sitting in the mask, a white square sitting in a black mask. If I alt-click on the mask, you can see down there we've got a square, the white letting through the adjustment and the black surrounding it, obscuring the adjustment that I just made. I'm going to edit and fill and use black, in other words black here, to fill the mask, making sure it's 100% and at mode normal. Then I can start revealing this adjustment from scratch. I'm going to take a brush tool, and in this case I'm going to brush it quite hard using 100% opacity and flow at the bottom there. So using quite a big brush, making sure it's soft, and painting in using white foreground colour. I'm now going to start in this corner here and just brush this in wherever I need it. So it brings out these sort of golden areas here at the bottom. I'm now going to take the opacity down a little bit and just get in between here and make some softer transitions. Even though I've made a test patch just in this area, there's nothing to stop me from using that. For example, in this tree here, there's a tree bark here which is a little bit more magenta, and I'm going to just make sure that that is also covered by this adjustment. I could take my opacity up a little bit when I do that, just to increase the efficiency of this. Also a couple of blobs back here which I'm going to cover. Okay, so what this adjustment has done is to take away a little bit of the pinkness in those soft out of focus blobs and bring a little bit of warmth to the bottom of the image. That also sets off some of those cooler colours and brings in fact out a little bit of the blue in the hat. Now I'm going to make another selective adjustment. Let me just zoom into 100% there and let's look at the face. I'm going to drag a marquee over the face and the fur. My aim here is to make it perhaps just a little bit less cool, maybe just warm it up ever so slightly and brighten ever so slightly as well. So I'm making a new curves. I promise you this is going to be the last curve, and target tool and just lift up slightly in the face. See if I can find a shadow in here, just drag that slightly down. Looking at the curve here, you see that it doesn't actually go below the baseline at any point. So what I've done is created a tiny bit of contrast without actually darkening the shadows. In fact, I could highlight that and just bump it up a tiny bit there. I feel that there's a little bit too much pinkness here, but I think it can be caused by blue. When skin goes pink, sometimes it can actually help to bring a little bit of yellow into it, so that means we head for the blue channel. As you know, there is only a red, green and a blue channel, but those three colours are responsible for the three complementary colours as well, cyan, magenta and yellow. So if you have, if you need to do anything with the yellow, you actually head for the blue channel as you do here. So I want to take the blue down just a touch, and you can see there's a more believable colour now to the fur and also to the skin. Now we mustn't forget that we're sitting here with a square in the image, so edit and fill, and because I used black last time I just hit OK. I take a brush tool. I'm going to go with 100% brush here. I'm taking the brush to a size that can sort of handle most of the face, and I'm just going to paint with white, a white brush, just to make absolutely sure that I avoid the hat. I'm going to press X to switch my swatches and just go over the rim of the hat. I might even go over the eyes because she has blue eyes, just making sure that there's no yellow spill up there. Now I think we've probably done enough curves here, but at this point I would like to see whether my colours are viable or not, printable or not. So I'm going to go to View and Proof Colours. That was actually the gamut warning I hit accidentally. But the gamut warning tells me that some of these blue colours and some of the green colours here are out of gamut. it means they're not going to print quite as nicely as we'd like to. I'm just going to turn the view gamut warning off for a moment and look at the view proof setup just to make sure that's on working CMYK. And I'm now going to press Command Y, so keep your eyes peeled on the image and see if the blue colours and the green colours change. Command Y, and as you can see there, some of those blue colours are a little bit too bright and too saturated. So you're looking now at a CMYK simulation. Turning that back again to RGB. Well, it will look great on screen, but probably not so great in print. So to kind of manage the expectations of my clients, I'm going to turn this blue down a little bit. I'm going to add now a hue saturation. In hue saturation, I'm going to show you two different ways of working with it. One is to work directly with this target tool and just pull the blue color away like this. Now that may work perfectly fine, and it often does, but sometimes it just misses the mark. Instead, I'm going to Command Z that, and I'm going to use the blues and click on this eyedropper here, and then click on the hat. And what you could see there, if you followed on the adjustments panel here, you could see that the blue range shifted slightly, so we've got now a more representative range of blue that we're going to affect. All I'm going to do here with the blues is literally desaturate a little bit. Before I do that, I should just really turn on the gamut warning and pull the saturation down till those grey little dots more or less go away. So I end up now on -29. I'm going to turn the gamut warning off again. The colour in the shawl here is a little bit electric still. We could perhaps go a touch further on this. Let me just turn the gamut warning on again. Yeah, so I'm going to take it a little bit further and maybe just use a brush tool at a lower opacity to bring back the hat a little bit, masking off a little bit of this effect on the hat. You'll see some of the dots coming back here, but I just want to get the hat as bright as possible, really. Turning off the gamut warning for a moment there, just to judge it. Turning it back on again because I'm now going to go to the green range. It'll be interesting now to see whether it actually responds to greens or whether it wants to jump to yellow. There are times when Photoshop and I don't quite agree on the colour. Clicking on this eyedropper, I'm going to click bang in the middle of an area where I've got this grey overlay, and again the colour jumped here on this bar here. As you can see, it's still greens. I'm just going to click around a little bit so you can see what often happens is that it jumps to yellows too. So it would disagree with my perception of what's green and what's yellow. Often we think, you know, grass is always green, leaves are always green, but very often Photoshop thinks they're yellow. Clicking back on this spot here again, we go back to greens, and I'm just going to take the saturation slightly down here, which is something I meant to do anyway, because I felt the image was slightly too green. Turning off the gamut warning and zooming out, and Command Y to see if any colours are changing here. Just a tiny little bit, especially in her shawl, but apart from that, I think it should print just fine. Looking at the image, and I find that this shawl might need taking out a little bit of this magenta. There's also an area here at the back which I feel is a bit too cyan. You may have noticed that I talked about two colours that are not in the RGB range, and let's look at the selective colour here. If you look at this command here and you look at the colours you actually have to work with here, cyan, magenta, yellow and black, that's actually CMYK. So really I think this is a CMYK command which is useful in RGB, but I tend to think in CMYK when I'm using it. I'm thinking actually in ink. And I know that this works because if you actually took every single one of these ranges and took everything down to 0, then you would have no colour at all in the image. Let's pick a range of magentas first of all. And in the magenta range, I'd actually like to take out some of the magenta. And if you watch the shawl, you can see here that this loses a bit of colour. I'm going to take a little bit of the magenta out, add a tiny bit of black, and also add some yellow in there. I'm also going to try adding a touch of cyan there. All I want to avoid really here is this pink colour. When it comes to the cyans that sort of troubled me here in the background, I felt there was a colour there that was a bit too strong. Let's see if that responds now on the cyan range. If I take the cyans down in the cyan, you do actually see some response there. I'm going to add in a little bit of yellow, maybe even dirty it up a little bit with some magenta there. And I think that might just about do the job. In fact, I'm going to take some of the black down in this range. No, that didn't quite work. I'm going to add some black instead, and that makes it a bit more similar to the other greens. So now let's see if there's anything we need to edit in this image. Overall, I'm quite happy with it. I feel that maybe what I've done here on the bottom layer isn't quite right. It's just too powerful in relation to the other colours. So I'm going to highlight the layer that I applied selectively. I think the problem lies possibly in the blue channel, where I've taken it down there to make it more golden. I believe that's okay in the shadows there, but if I lift it slightly up in the highlight, I feel that I get more of that contrast back, and it becomes less flat there. Let's review that change. Command Z and Command Z. Well, it's quite subtle. So what I might end up doing is taking that layer down a little bit. Let's just turn it off and on again. I believe that it works okay on the right hand side of the image, but not so much on the left. And I'm wondering also if I could apply just a little bit more of this on the right hand side. So I'm going to use the gradient and just try and pull a gradient slightly in here on the right hand side, and I feel that that kind of warmed up that tree slightly. I'm going to use the gradient again, just pressing X so that I pull a black gradient in here from the other side, and that's not at full strength, so I'm going to just bring that up a little bit stronger and pull that in to lose some of that adjustment, turning the adjustment off and back on again. You are working fairly subtle when you're working with colour in Photoshop, building up, doing the work step by step, and often going away from it, coming back to it later and seeing it in another light, in another frame of mind, and you may find that you want to make some changes. Maybe I come back tomorrow and I see something that's, this jars a little bit. The whole point is that you get to something that you finally are happy with, and you can live with. And also the great thing about this is that these layers are now editable. You don't necessarily have to make a new adjustment layer. You can tinker with the ones that you've got. Now the last thing I'm going to do is actually just something very simple. I'm going to highlight the top layer and the levels one, press Command G, and this forms a whole group. I'm going to just call it color, and finally just review the before and after, turning off this one group, and it's almost a shock to see the image as we started out. Turning it back on again, that's a lot fresher.
But it is not really a bossa nova. But we think that you will dig this.